In this episode, I'm going to show you 3 easy ways to tie the figure of 8 loop knot, firstly by hand and 2 alternative ways using the Preston loop tyer. The figure of 8 loop knot is most commonly used in the coarse fishing world, but it can also be used for sea fishing and fly fishing. Figure of 8 loop knot can be tied using braid, mono or fluorocarbon lines. I'm using a thicker piece of line just for demonstration purposes. Firstly, take your line and form a loop in your line. Your doubled over line, form a loop in the line so that it crosses over on top of the loop that you've just made. Be sure to give yourself enough room to form the knot. Take your end loop and take it round the back of the loop that you've just formed, and you can hold this in place with your forefinger and thumb. Take the end loop again and put it through the loop that you've just formed. You should have something that resembles a figure of 8 in your doubled over line. Before tightening up your knot, I will always recommend to moisten your line with either saliva or water. Pull tight on your loop to form your knot, and that gives you the perfect figure of 8 loop knot. When tying the figure of 8 loop knot by hand, it gives you a bit of versatility to tie the loop of whatever size you want, but it can be more difficult to tie really small loop knots. For very small loop knots or loop knots that need to be a uniform size, I use one of these loop tying tools. This tool is made by Preston, and there's many other manufacturers that make loop tyers. They come in a variety of different sizes and colours. The size of the knot that you want to tie can be determined by the gap between the neck of the loop tyer and the top of the loop tyer. This loop tyer is approximately 10mm from the neck to the top, which will tie 10mm loop knots. You can use a loop tyer in 2 ways. The first way is the most common way. In this demonstration, I'm using a thicker piece of mono for visual purposes. With your mono, form a loop. Put the loop on the end of your finger and hold it in place with your index finger and thumb. Then take your loop tyer and put it behind the loop that you've formed. Turn the loop tyer 1 full turn until it's pointing up the way. With the loop that's in your finger, then put that into the jaws of the loop tyer. At this stage, you can let go of the loop and you can start pulling down on your knot. Once you pull your line to the top of the loop tyer, that will be your desired length of knot. At this stage, just gently ease the knot off the end of the loop tyer, which has formed the loop. Also at this stage, I would recommend that you moisten your knot. Once your knot's moistened, you can then cinch down fully on your knot with a bit of pressure. Take the loop off the loop tyer, and that is your 10mm loop knot formed. Once you're happy with your figure of 8 loop knot, you can then go ahead and trim the tag ends. And there you have the perfect figure of 8 loop knot. If you want to make a slightly larger loop using the loop tyer, this can also be done. As with using the loop tyer the first way, form your loop, holding the loop in your forefinger and grabbing the 2 ends with your forefinger and thumb. Take your loop tyer, go behind the loop that you've formed and do 1 full turn. Put the loop that's in your forefinger into the jaws of the loop tyer. And unlike making the small loop, instead of pulling down on the 2 lines, at this stage all you do is ease the lines off the loop tyer as if you're making the normal loop, which forms a larger loop. At this stage, before you fully tighten down, again, always recommend that you moisten the knot. Pull your knot tight. Remove the tag ends. And there you have your larger loop using the loop tyer. This is the original one and this is the larger one. The second way to use a loop tyer is predominantly used by anglers when they want to achieve an exact length of hook length. In this case I'm using a jig and I want to achieve a 6-inch hook length. One end of your line would be tied to your hook, which goes on to one end of the jig. The other end of your line, you form a loop around the end jig of the desired length that you want to achieve. You then have a loop formed around your jig. Keeping your line tight, you then want to grab the line between your forefinger and thumb. Keeping a hold of both lines, remove your hook from your jig and you can then start to tie your loop. Keeping hold of the line so that it doesn't slip. At this stage you want to form a loop in your line, much like the way you would form a loop tying a figure of 8 loop by hand. Fold your line over to form a loop. You then have a loop with the line crossing over on top. Take your loop tyer and go through down the loop that you just formed. Take one full turn and take your end loop and put that into the jaws of the loop tyer. At this stage you can pull on both lines, which forms your figure of 8 loop. Gently slide your loop off the loop tyer, and at this stage I would always recommend to moisten your knot. Firmly pull down on your knot to form your figure of 8 loop knot and remove it from the jaws of the loop tyer. Trim, as always, your tag ends. You then end up with a loop to a hook length that is at the perfect length that you want. As a quick additional tip, I'd like to show you how to do a loop-to-loop joining connection. The most popular reason for joining two pieces of line loop to loop is for a main line to a hook length. Now, this could be from a feeder or it could be from a float rig. There's two ways anglers join loop-to-loop connections, the right way and the wrong way. I'm going to demonstrate the correct way to join two loops together the correct way. Firstly, take your loop that's coming from your main line, whether it be from your feeder or your float rig. Put this loop, in this case is going to be a hook length. Take this loop and put it through your hook length loop. Take your hook that's already attached and put it through your main line loop. Pulling on your two loops, you'll then have a quick and easy join with minimum friction between the two lines. And that is the correct way to do loop-to-loop connection.